Hang on. Let's go back a sec. Who is this guy? Edward Davis Wood Jr. was born in New York State in 1924. His father, Ed Wood Sr., wanted Ed to be a football player, or a baseball player, or a businessman, or a politician, so that he could brag about it to all of his friends at the bar. When he discovered Ed preferred to spend his time in the cinema and playing imaginary monsters, he eventually lost all interest in raising his son and handed responsibility to Ed's mother. His mother Lillian had always wanted a girl and coped with this fact by dressing Ed in girls' clothing. This had a lasting effect on Wood, and for the rest of his life he would dress in women's clothing and makeup and go out at night. In public, dressed as a woman in the 1940s.
What Jimmy didn't know was that Ralph was sick, a sickness that was not visible like smallpox, but no less dangerous and contagious, a sickness of the mind. You see, Ralph was a homosexual.
Despite this, Wood was adamant that he was a straight male. There was nothing sexual about his cross-dressing activities, it was merely comforting to him as it reminded him of his mother. His female alter ego was called Shirley. During the Second World War, Wood served in the US Army on the Pacific Theatre, seeing combat only once before he contracted a tropical disease and did mostly desk work for the rest of his service. Wood claimed that he was more scared of being injured than being killed. If he was shot and needed operating on, they'd discover he wore women's underwear underneath his military uniform. At the end of the war, Wood went to art school to study film and drama, and spent the rest of the 1940s living with a travelling carnival, writing scripts, and directing a few TV advertisements. Along the way, he produced a few stage plays and short films. This didn't work out for him, so he packed his bags and moved to Hollywood, determined to join the greats of cinema like his idol, Orson Welles. Having spent the past 2 decades consistently pumping out high-quality films in spite of war and economic depression, Hollywood was truly in high esteem. But with every success comes imitators and knockoffs trying to ride on coattails. As film equipment became cheaper, more and more small studios were set up to create a landfill of low-budget, low-quality movies to cash in on the prestige of Hollywood. One of these studios was headed by Mr. George Weiss, who, wanting to capitalise on the news of the world's first sex change operation in 1953, advertised for a director to produce a movie about the subject. You can see where this is going. Of course, our man Ed Wood was the first in line for the job. The script Wood eventually submitted to Weiss was not actually about a sex change operation, but a semi-documentary about Wood's own experience being a cross-dresser. Weiss approved it anyway, and Wood set out to work on his first ever commissioned film, Glen or Glenda. First though, he needed actors, and wouldn't you know it, Wood just happened to know one out-of-work, extremely famous, morphine-addicted celebrity, Bela Lugosi. You know, that Bela Lugosi, the original Dracula, the famed stage and film actor, World War I hero, that Bela Lugosi. Now past his time and forgotten by Hollywood, forced to act in Ed's Wood awful film to get by. The whole film was shot in 4 days, with very few shots having more than one take, and almost the entire second half is made up using stock footage. This is actually something Wood did a lot. Sometimes he'd do it right, like this sequence. And other times his choices were a bit more bizarre, like randomly inserting a shot of a buffalo stampede.
Glen, is it another woman?
I went and watched the entirety of Glen or Glenda, so you don't have to, by the way. It's on Wikipedia actually, so here are some of the highlights.
Only the infinity of the depths of a man's mind can really tell the story.
Beware, beware, beware of the big green dragon that sits on your doorstep. He eats little boys.
When it came to release, mainstream theatres thought it was too weird to show, and burlesque houses didn't think it had enough sex in it to be shown there either. When the film was submitted for a UK release, British film censors banned the film entirely. Overall, the film was a flop. Usually, an aspiring artist might sit down, evaluate what went wrong, and make a plan for how to make their next piece of work better. Not Ed Wood though. He immediately started work on 2 more projects, a TV show pilot called Crossroads Avengers, which was immediately rejected by NBC, and a 1954 crime thriller called Jailbait. Wood had some help with the writing and used some professional actors for this one, so Jailbait became Wood's highest critically acclaimed film, sitting at a wonderful 29% on Rotten Tomatoes. This was good enough to get Wood to keep going, and year after year, Ed produced low-budget movie after low-budget movie. He asked anyone and everyone for financing, including random women he met at bars and slaughterhouse owners. The stars were made up of anyone he could find, including Swedish wrestler Tor Johnson, Playboy model Jean Moorhead, the host of a bad late-night horror show called Vampira, and an out-of-work TV clairvoyant. In 1956, Wood set out to make his magnum opus, a Western horror film starring the greats of Western films and horror films, John Carradine, Bela Lugosi, and Lon Chaney Jr. Tragically, Bela Lugosi died shortly after pre-production began, and the only footage Wood managed to take of him were a few test shots in his Dracula costume outside his house. Desperate to make use of the last ever footage of the cinema legend, Wood threw together a script for a different magnum opus, Plan 9 from Outer Space, a sci-fi horror epic that was to be his greatest work. Shot in 5 days, the film centers on a group of aliens who attempt to revive all the dead people on Earth to raise awareness for the fact that humanity's constant strive for better nuclear weapons will eventually destroy the entire universe. Then the main character goes on board the alien ship, punches the alien, the ship crash lands, then they all die. The end. The film features awful dialogue.
Future events such as these will affect you in the future.
Bad acting.
I thought it did. Don't like hearing noises, especially when there ain't supposed to be any. Yeah, sort of spooky-like.
This guy clearly reading from a script on his lap. Obviously fake sets. Continuity mistakes. And other technical mistakes. You can see the f***ing microphone in the top of the screen. This is all in the first 7 minutes, by the way. It truly was the most Ed Wood film that Ed Wood ever made. Apparently the dialogue Wood had written for Vampira was so bad she demanded to just be an entirely silent character. And that's actually what happened. When the film was finished, Wood hadn't even lined up a distributor, and it wasn't until 3 years later when the film could finally be released. At last, the public could see Wood's great magnum opus. It was a flop. Still, after all this time, completely undeterred, Wood went on to write The Violent Years, a thriller about a teenage girl who is a high schooler by day, but a crime boss by night. He was paid $500 for the script, but had no input in the film's production. Unlucky for him because it was the highest grossing film that ever had any of his input, and he didn't see a cent of it. For the next 3 years, Wood wandered aimlessly around Hollywood, handing out his scripts and ideas to studios, but they never took him up on any of his offers. Eventually, Wood was so down on his luck that he sold all the rights to Plan 9 for $1. You may think Wood was some kind of loser, eternally made fun of as the guy who made pathetic movies and put his actors through extreme embarrassment that they had to do for money, but in reality, Wood was well loved by his peers. Energetic, overconfident, eccentric, and full of passion, there was something about Ed that made people like him. Hence why his cast came back time after time to help him make his films. Even though being associated with Ed would mean the end of your serious acting career and also your financial stability, they just kept coming back. But you can't make a film on just good wishes. Ed still had no money and was getting desperate. In the 1960s, he tried to capitalise on the growing sexual liberation of society by publishing smut films and books.
Now, I love girls. Girls, girls, girls. Tall ones, fat ones, doesn't matter. Any kind of girls. Blondes, brunettes, redheads. Girls, girls, girl. I have only one problem. There isn't enough time for all of them.
1960's The Sinister Urge shows a film producer quite like Ed lamenting about the fact that he used to make good films, but now has been forced to make pornography.
I look at this slush and try to remember. At one time I made good movies.
Evidently, Wood was unhappy that he was forced into making pornos. He eventually turned to alcoholism, spending all of his disposable income on booze. The quality of his films dropped dramatically, and even the friends who had stuck by him refused to act in any more films. Not because they didn't want to, but because Ed had become an unreliable drunkard. Eventually, the money ran out and Wood was evicted from his home, his entire library of scripts and books thrown into the trash by his landlord. With nothing but the shirt on his back, Wood and his wife moved into a friend's apartment. 3 days later, after a weekend of binge drinking, Ed Wood was found dead from a heart attack, aged 54, on December 10th, 1978. In 1980, film critic Michael Medved rediscovered Plan 9 from outer space, and in his book The Golden Turkey Awards, he declared Wood the worst director of all time. This renewed interest in his work, and since then, his work has achieved cult status. Turns out people enjoy his weird style of crappy dialogue and bizarre plots. They even made an Oscar-winning movie about him. Plan 9 was even turned into a stage musical.
The end of our civilization is at the beck and call. We saw saucer.
In 1999, one of Wood's unproduced scripts, I Woke Up Early the Day I Died, was actually made into a full movie starring Ron Perlman and Andrew McCarthy. The film was supposed to be a tribute to Wood, and the producers even went as far as using the techniques he used, like copious use of stock footage, but the critics and fans of Wood didn't particularly rate it. The thing that made Wood's work special was that he wasn't trying to be terrible, it was just innocently bad. When anyone tries to make something bad on purpose, it becomes unwatchable and embarrassing for all involved. But there was something about Wood's work that, although fundamentally terrible, makes it worthwhile watching. Ed Wood finally got his big break, but it wasn't in the world he lived in. He was just really, really ahead of his time.
Plan 9 from outer space, one night only, the big screen. My hands are tied. You don't understand. This isn't plans 1 through 8 from outer space. This is Plan 9. This is the one that worked. The worst movie ever made. Hey, I got news.